Hi everyone, this lesson is the beginning of our arguments unit. So our last lesson focused on the difference between fact and opinion. So this lesson is going to work with us to define argument and give us a better understanding of what it means when we talk about an argument. So before we get going, I want to really quickly review what we talked about with our last lesson, which was the difference between fact and opinion. So for us, what we're going to say is a fact is something that can be proven. So it's something I can prove. And we are going to talk about using those words verify, check, and prove as a way to help us tell if it's a fact. If it's a fact, we should be able to verify it, we should be able to check it, or we should be able to prove it. Now, the opposite of that idea is an opinion. So an opinion, we said, is someone's personal beliefs or ideas about a subject. And we said that these things can't be proven and that they are neither true nor false. So we want to keep these in mind as we go through our lesson today, because we're going to use these definitions to help us talk a little bit more about argument and what argument means to us. So the reason that we are starting here with argument is because it's really helpful for one of the major GED skills we need. That skill is the same as it was last week, the ability to evaluate the relevance and sufficiency of evidence offered in support of a claim. So in order to get to this skill, this is a stepping stone. So this week, to help us get to that skill, we're going to work on defining argument. So we're going to work on coming up with a clear definition for what an argument is, so that we can all talk about it together the same way. We are going to talk about what the truth is behind an argument. So what does it mean to have an argument? What does this look like in writing? What does this look like when we take our GED test? So we're going to talk about some of the myths and truths behind argument writing. And lastly, we're going to work on identifying and creating both sides of an argument. So we want to be able to not only identify what an argument is, but we're going to also work on identifying the opposite of an argument. And we're going to work on creating reasons to support both sides of that argument. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're going to do is we are going to do a little true or false practice. So on your notes page, wherever you're taking notes at, I want you to label your page 1 through 5. I'm going to put up 5 different sentences, and I'd like for you to make a guess about what you think each of these statements is. Is the statement true or is the statement false? We're going to come back to each of these statements at the end of the lesson after we've had a chance to kind of discuss all of the information about arguments first. So my first sentence is that you can only make an argument about something if you feel very strongly about it. If you feel that this is true, write true next to number 1. If you feel that this is false, write false next to number 1. Once again, number 1 is you can only make an argument about something if you feel very strongly about it. Number 2, persuasive writing is meant to convince someone that something is true. So again, for number 2, if you think this is true, write true. If you think it's false, write false. Number 2 reads, persuasive writing is meant to convince someone that something is true. Number 3, all arguments are equally strong. All arguments are equally strong. Do you think this is true or false? Write down your answer. Number 4, an argument is a statement that one believes to be true. An argument is a statement that one believes to be true. If you think this is true, write true. If you think this is false, write false. And number 5, there is a right and a wrong side to every argument. There is a right and a wrong side to every argument. If you think this is true, go ahead and write true. And if you think it's false, write false. So on your page, you should have the numbers 1 through 5, and your true or false answer should be next to each of those things. Like I said, we're going to come back to these at the end of our lesson, and we're going to look at whether or not they actually are true or false statements. So we're going to compare our pre-lesson answers to our post-lesson answers. So before we get to that point, though, let's get started with defining what an argument actually is. So here is our definition for argument. We are going to say that an argument is a statement that someone believes is true or should be true. So when I look at this definition, a statement that someone believes is true or should be true, there are two words that stand out to me. The word believes and the word should. The words believe and should are both opinion words. We said that last week there were certain words that when we see them, they automatically to us signal that something is an opinion. The words believe and should are those types of opinion words. So what this means to me is that an argument states an opinion. It tells me something that a person believes is true or that they believe something should be true. So we really want to tie together the idea that an argument is an opinion, that they are statements of our own opinions. It doesn't mean that we can't prove them with facts, but it means that an argument at its core is an opinion. It is a personal belief that someone holds. And I have a couple of good examples here that show us examples of arguments. Things like school uniforms are needed in high school. That's an argument that someone could make. The legal driving age should be 18. That's an argument that someone could make. And I see that word should here, which automatically tells me that I'm dealing with an opinion. School should be held Monday through Saturday. Again, this is an argument that a person could make, and I see that word should has come again. Students should be allowed to use cell phones in class. Okay, I'm seeing that argument word and I'm seeing that opinion word here with should. Cats make better pets than dogs. Okay, I could see that happening too. What we want to remember with each of these is that these are personal statements that someone believes to be true. And since they're personal, we know we're dealing with an opinion. That's got to be our key takeaway here, is that whenever we see opinion words, we want to think of personal ideas. And when we see argument, we want to think of opinion. Now, for every argument that you have to have an opposite idea. That's called a counter argument. When we see this word counter, it means to go against something. So when I see a counter argument, it literally means that I am going against the argument. I'm countering that argument. So our definition of a counter argument is that it expresses the opposite point of view. Now we talked about point of view when we talked about the author. We said that you can have a positive, negative, or neutral point of view, and that the point of view just expresses what the author thinks or feels about an idea. The same thing happens here with argument and counter argument because we're dealing with personal beliefs, thoughts, and ideas. What makes the argument and counter argument different is they function as opposites. We know that this word means that they are two different sides of something. So what I've done is I've rewritten my arguments from the previous slide to show counter arguments. And what we're going to notice is that not a lot has actually changed. School uniforms are not needed in high school. This is the opposite of the argument that school uniforms are needed in high school. The legal driving age should not be 18. Again, this is my opposite argument for saying that the legal driving age should be 18. School should not be held Monday through Saturday. Counter argument. Schools should not be allowed to use cell phones in class. Counter argument. Cats do not make better pets than dogs. Counter argument. So whenever we see argument, we always want to think that there has to be an opposite side to that idea. In your GED, when you are taking that test, sometimes the argument and counter argument are going to be in one reading. So you're going to see both sides, both points of view in the same reading. And sometimes they're going to be in separate readings. So you'll have one reading that states one person's argument, and you'll have another reading that states another person's counter argument. So you will have two separate points of view written on two different readings there. So we want to be on the lookout for that. But keep in mind that anytime you see argument, there is always going to be an opposite side. It doesn't matter what we are working with, there's always an opposite to each argument. So what is the truth about argument writing? We're going to look at some myths and realities that we have about argument writing. And before we get going with what those myths and realities are, I want to take a minute to talk about what that word myth means. The first way that we think of myth is that it is a story that can be told to teach something. So most cultures have myths or tall tales. They are stories that we create to teach lessons, to explain how something has occurred or why something has occurred, things like creation stories or why the weather does the things it does. The second way that we use that word myth is to say that it is a false claim or a false idea that many people hold true. So one good example of a myth that I've heard recently is that I've heard that there is a group of people that believe that the earth is flat, even though there is a ton of scientific evidence that says that the earth is round. That's a good example of a myth, saying that the earth is flat. That's a myth because it is something that we can prove to be untrue, but there are still groups of people that believe in it. So we're going to be using this second definition of myth here to talk about our differences between reality and myths of arguments. So the first myth that I have is that an argument is just people yelling at each other. When we think of arguments on TV or in movies, we tend to think of things where people are very passionate about the things that they're talking about their ideas and personal opinions. And so things get pretty heated quickly and it turns into people just yelling at each other. But what we want to remember is that that is just not true. In reality, arguments can be very calm. What we are really doing is just trying to get our ideas across. And we know that the easiest way to get someone to believe our ideas is to present it in a way that makes it easy to understand, and that is pretty calm and collected. When we talk about argument writing, that's even silent, because when you write something, there is really no vocalization at all. We're just writing down our ideas. The second myth that we talk about is that you have to totally believe what you're arguing. Again, this is not true. The reality is that the argument has nothing to do with how you feel. And this is something that once again comes back to your GED test. When you deal with the argument writing and the argument readings, usually they're about topics that we don't really have a strong opinion about. So we don't have to necessarily totally believe what we're talking about to be able to have a good argument. You don't have to feel strongly about it. You just have to be able to create an argument around it. And we're actually going to practice this in just a few minutes. And the last myth is that every argument has a right and a wrong side. So my problem with this statement is actually just the idea of right and wrong. So right and wrong are the things that I have a problem with. When we talk about right and wrong, it makes it sound like one is correct and one is incorrect. And that's not really exactly what we want to get at. What we want to remember instead is that most of the time you are just looking at two sides of the argument that are just different points of view. So they're just different ways of looking at something. Neither side is really right nor wrong. What we really want to use here is that instead of using right and wrong, we want to use the words valid and invalid. When we talk about something that is valid, it is an idea that we can prove with facts. And it's going to be something that is well supported. The opposite of that idea is something that is invalid. When we see IN in front of something, it means not, or the opposite of. So invalid literally means the opposite of valid. It is not valid. These are ideas that cannot be proven. or they are poorly supported. So when we talk about argument, we do not want to be using these words right and wrong. We want to be using valid and invalid. And the reason behind this has to do with the fact that an argument states an opinion. We know that opinions can neither be true nor false because we can't prove them. What we can do, though, is we can create a valid opinion or a valid argument. It is a type of opinion that can be proven with good facts, or a type of argument that can be proven with good facts. So when we use that word valid and invalid, these can go with the words opinion and argument. So you can have a valid argument, or you can have an invalid argument, or you could have a valid opinion or an invalid opinion. So I just really want to caution you, don't use right and wrong. We want to instead use valid and invalid, because making an argument is all about the proof that, the proof that we use, and not necessarily what we believe. It's all about the proof. And we've talked about this before. When we talked about main idea, we said we had to be able to prove it. When we talked about text structure, we said we had to be able to prove it with evidence. When we talked about transition words, we said we needed to be able to prove what they were doing. So this idea of finding proof is not new to us, but what we want to remember is that in order for you to have a solid argument, it needs to be valid. It needs to be a valid opinion. So we want to keep these two words in mind as we're moving forward. I highly recommend writing down valid and invalid in your vocabulary tracker or wherever you're taking your notes. That way you have them for later. All right, so why do we argue? What's the point of arguing? I came up with a couple of examples here of different arguments that you could make or reasons why you would argue. So I've got ones like maybe your child wants to convince you to extend their bedtime. They're going to make an argument. Maybe your child wants to convince you to watch Sesame Street. They're going to make an argument. Maybe you want to convince your friend to do the ice bucket challenge. You're going to make an argument. Maybe you want to convince your significant other that you need a Harley. You need to make that argument. And maybe you want to convince me, your teacher, that your idea is valid. Again, you are gonna make that argument. So what do all of these things have in common? There's one word that all of those share, and that word is the word convince. So convince is a word that we've seen before. We saw it when we were talking about author's purpose, and we said that one of the purposes that an author has is to persuade you. Now, when we persuade, we are convincing. So why do we argue? We argue to persuade someone, to convince them that our ideas are correct. So we said that if your author's purpose is to persuade, that works for things on TV like commercials and advertisements. They're trying to persuade you to buy their product, do their thing, enjoy their vacation spot, whatever it may be. They're trying to convince you to do it. We said that in writing, things like opinions, things like op-eds, things like editorials, and all arguments are persuasive because their end goal is to convince you to do something. So arguments are meant to persuade. That is their full purpose. Arguments are meant to persuade. And since arguments are meant to be persuasive, they have to have good support. I'm not really going to believe something if there's not good support to go with it. So we want to be able to support our ideas with good reasons and good evidence. Our next lesson is going to focus on how to identify a good reason and a good piece of evidence from a bad piece of evidence and a bad reason. So we're going to work on how those work next week, but I just want to show you an example of how that might work. So I might say something like, kids should not have to go to school on Saturday. That's my main argument. But in order to make that argument a valid argument, I need to have reasons to support it. And I included reasons like students need rest. We know that as we learn, we need to rest to be able to digest what we know and to kind of get it to stick in our memories. We also have, my second reason here is that some students have jobs. If those are high school students working on the weekends, maybe the time that they work best. So we don't really want to take that away from them. And then my last reason to support this argument is that family time is important and that weekend time can be time to be spent with family. So when we create our main arguments here, we want to make sure that we can really support those ideas. And we're going to look at how we do that on our next slide. All right, so this performer is Sia. So she had a couple of hits a couple of years ago, and I happen to really enjoy her music. And so I came up with a scenario. When Sia performs, she wears these really big bows on her head. So if you notice, that's her head right there. So this is just a gigantic bow. So I came up with this situation. She is performing at a new venue, so a new location. The venue has a rule that no hats are allowed. Hats are defined as anything that covers and protects a person's head. She got in trouble for breaking the no hats rule. So before we actually make this argument, I want to know what you think. On your page, right below your true-false statements and your definitions, I want you to write down what you think. Did Sia really violate this rule? What's your opinion? Did she break this rule? Let's talk about the arguments we can have about Sia and her bow here. So there are two possible arguments that we can make. The first argument, number one, is that she did not violate the rule because a bow is not a hat. So imagine we are lawyers here. We want to kind of think like a lawyer, put ourselves in those shoes. We need to either get Sia out of trouble if we are on her team, or get her into trouble if we are on the venue's team. So option one here is the argument that we are making. That she did not get in trouble. She should not get in trouble because she did not violate the rule. So this is the argument, and this means that you are on Sia's team. The second argument that we could make, the counter argument, is that she did violate the rule because her bow is a hat. Remember, every argument has two sides, the argument and counter argument. If we argue this one, we are arguing for the side of the venue, that she should be in trouble because the bow counts as a hat. What's really important to remember is that what you think about Sia's bow, at this point, it doesn't matter. I really don't have any personal opinions about this. I mean, I don't really care whether or not she gets into trouble. I'm not personally invested in this. I don't have to make this argument if I don't want to. But what we want to remember is that you should be able to argue for both sides, no matter which side you think is right. So on the slide before this, I asked for you to make your judgment. What did you think? Should she be in trouble or should she not? Regardless of what you answered, at this point, it doesn't matter, because we need to be able to look at both sides of an argument and say, yes, she should be in trouble, and here are the reasons why. And we should be able to say, no, she shouldn't be in trouble, and here are the reasons why. We want to make sure that we can do both of those things. And that's actually what we're going to do. So we are going to look at both sides of the argument here, and we're going to come up with a different group of reasons for each one. So for the first group of reasons, we're looking for 3 reasons that her bow is a hat. So this is our counter argument. And this is what we would argue if we were on the venue's legal team. And our second group of reasons, we're arguing that her bow is not a hat. So this was our first argument. And this is the argument we would make if we were on Sia's legal team. So what we want to remember, we want to keep this in mind, is that the rule says that a hat is anything that covers and protects a person's head. So we want to think like a lawyer, and that means we need to think about what is actually being said here. So I'm going to think about the definition that we use in order to come up with my reasons. So I'm going to start with my first group. So this was my argument if I was arguing for the venue, the counter argument here, that her bow is a hat. So I need to come up with 3 reasons why her bow is a hat. So the first reason, I'm going to use that definition of covers here. I'm going to say that her bow covers most of her head. And for that reason, her bow counts as a hat. I'm going to say that that covering makes it work here. My second reason that her bow is a hat. Okay, let's use our definition here again. We had already said covers. Let's use protect. Can her bow protect her from anything? So I really don't think bows do a lot of protecting, but since we're on that legal team, we need to make that argument anyway. So maybe her bow can protect most of her head from the sun. So I'm going to use that. Her bow protects from the sun. That's my second reason I think she should get in trouble. Okay, my third reason. Is there anything else in my definition that I can use? A hat is anything that covers and protects a person's head. Well, she is wearing it on her head. So maybe I can say that because it's on her head, it counts as a hat. So I'm going to say that anything on the head counts as a hat. So I've come up with my 3 reasons as if I worked for the venue's legal team. So I'm going to do the same thing for my second group of reasons here. So if I'm on Sia's legal team, so I want to know why she should not be in trouble. So again, I'm going to use that definition. And the first thing that stands out to me is that a bow is not defined as the same thing as a hat. So a bow and a hat have separate definitions. So I don't think we should be using them the same way. That's my reason number 1 here. Reason number 2, I'm going to come back to those ideas of covers and protects. So let's think about cover. I don't think her bow covers her whole head. A hat might cover the whole head. So I'm going to say that the bow doesn't cover her whole head. And if I think about that idea of protecting, I don't think a bow is going to really do a good job of protecting your head from anything. Bows don't protect. So what I did for both sides of my argument here, my argument and my counter argument, I was able to create reasons to support both of those ideas using the definition that was given to me. It doesn't matter what my personal belief was. I personally don't think she should be in trouble. That doesn't mean that I can't create an argument in support of the venue. So what we want to keep in mind is that as you are writing and reading, it doesn't matter if you agree with that person or not. What matters is that you are using the information to come to a good conclusion, and you are using the information given to build good arguments. So we want to make sure we're taking our personal feelings out before we keep going. All right, so let's look at a couple of argument samples to see whose team they belong to. So what argument does it belong to? So we're going to look at different examples about Sia's bow. And we want to remember that the venue rules say that a hat is anything that covers and protects a person's head. So argument 1 states that a bow is something on her head, something on her head. So who does this help? Does this help the argument that supports the idea that Sia did not violate the rule? So this means we would be on Sia's team. Or does it mean that this argument supports the idea that Sia did violate the rule, meaning that we would be on the venue's legal team? Okay, so coming back to the definition, it's anything that covers and protects a person's head. Well, if the bow is on her head, I think that might fit the definition of the rule there. So I think that this actually is going to belong to the venue. I think this would belong to an argument that the venue might make. And that's my correct answer here. Here's our second argument. The bow on her head is too flimsy to be a hat. Okay, which team would make this argument? Pause the video and make your decision. All right, so the bow on her head is too flimsy to be a hat. Well, if it's too flimsy to count as a hat, then it doesn't seem to meet those definitions. This means that this is an argument that Sia's legal team could make to keep her from getting in trouble. Here's our third argument. The bow does not cover all of Sia's head. Which legal team would make this argument? Sia's legal team or the venue's legal team? Pause the video and make your decision. Okay, so since the bow does not cover all of her head, my thought is that it doesn't match the definition of covering. So for me, this argument is an argument that Sia's legal team could make. Here's our fourth argument. The bow can protect Sia's head from rain or dust. Choose whose legal team would make this argument. Pause the video and make your decision. Okay, so since this says that the bow can protect her head, that means that it counts as something that covers a head. So I think this is an argument that the venue would make. Okay, so here's my last argument. The bow cannot keep Sia's head warm. If it can't keep her head warm, I don't think it really counts as protecting her head from the cold. So this is something that I think Sia's team would make. All right, so this brings us to our last little bit of our lesson today. We're talking about the strength of an argument. Some arguments are stronger than other arguments. And this is just something that happens. What we want to keep in mind is that the more evidence you have, the more you can support your argument, the better that argument is. So we are going to look at each of these four arguments and decide which one is a good argument and which one is not a good argument. So I've got A, the bow doesn't look like a hat. B, only girls wear bows. C, the bow would not keep Sia's head warm. Or D, the bow is dumb. So I want to look at these and I want to try to eliminate some. And I want to kind of think back to my definition. My definition says that I need to cover and protect in order for it to be a hat. Well, I'm going to go ahead and eliminate D and B then. These are not really good arguments because number one, they have nothing to do with covering and protecting. Also, I don't think I would really be able to prove them. I can't prove that bows are dumb because this is an opinion word, so I can't really do a lot of proving with that. So that leaves me A and C. A, the bow doesn't look like a hat. So we kind of mentioned that earlier, right? A bow is not the same thing as a hat. And C, the bow would not keep Sia's head warm, would not keep her head warm. So again, in choosing the strongest, I want to think about that definition, cover and protect. A doesn't really mention anything about covering and protecting. So what that means is that I'm going to choose C as my strongest argument out there because we are saying that this meets the definition. It helps explain the definition well. So some arguments that we make are always going to be better than other arguments that we make. All right, so let's wrap it up. I want to go over our true or false sentences one more time and see if you've changed your mind. So number one, you can only make an argument about something if you feel strongly about it. What did you choose? Did you choose true or false? For me, I think that this is false. And we kind of proved that with all of this work that we've done with Sia and her bow. I don't necessarily need to believe when I'm arguing to make a good argument. It just means that I need to be able to work with the information that I've been given. Number two, persuasive writing is meant to convince someone that something is true. What did you write? Did you write true or false? This is a true statement. Persuasive and convincing go together. When you try to persuade someone, your goal is to convince them that you are saying the right, correct thing. that your ideas are true, and that you should do, think, or believe like they do. So this is a true sentence. Number 3, all arguments are equally strong. What did you say? True or false? For me, this is false. And we just looked at that. Some some arguments are really great. They do really well with giving supporting information. They give everything you need. And some I just can't talk about. I can't prove them, and they're not going to help me along my way. Number 4, an argument is a statement that one believes to be true. What did you put? True or false? For me, this one is true. It is a statement that you believe in order to make that argument. Even if it's not something you care about, you can still believe it for that moment to write down your argument. And lastly, we had right and wrong side. What I want you to remember here is right and wrong. What did you pick at the beginning? What are you going to pick now? For me, this answer is false, and it comes down to right and wrong once again. Remember that when we use right and wrong, we want to get away from using these words. Instead, we want to go back to using valid and invalid. We want to start using those words in place of right and wrong. Valid and invalid are what we need to be using. All right, everybody. So this lesson we said focused on argument. If you are having any type of questions, or if you're feeling stuck with anything that we've covered today, make sure you send me a message. Let me know if you need help. You can always reach me on email, by phone, or over Remind, and I'll be glad to help you. Our homework with this lesson focuses on making sure we can identify argument and counter argument, looking at those true and false statements, and building an argument to support a rather silly idea. So go for your homework, give it a try, and I look forward to seeing your work. All right, everyone. See you later.